Hey, deserving listeners, we have a very special guest with us today, Adam Nimoy. You are in town talking about your book that came out last year. It is called The Most Human, Reconciling with My Father, Leonard Nimoy. You noticed when you came in my office that I have Beatles memorabilia and Spock memorabilia, your father. Mm-hmm. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
What can you tell us about your book? It's a personal book, I find. It's very easy to read. It moves really quick, and it sort of phases in and out of your childhood, your relationship with your father, your own adult ups and downs, and your own fatherhood yourself. So it's like 3 generations. What would you like to tell the listeners about the book?
Well, I think the bottom line and the basic theme of the book is how recovery enabled me to reconcile with my dad. That much like many other families, we had some dysfunction in the family. My dad and I had a lot of trouble relating to each other, beginning when I was very young, and kind of blossomed into full-on conflict with him when I became a teenager, part of the job of a teenager. And then for the next 30 years or so, my dad and I had this kind of strange relationship of these incredible experiences being the son of Leonard Nimoy and the tremendous success that he had enjoyed, coupled with periodic and regular episodes of outright conflict with my dad. And this was all exacerbated by the fact that my dad was an alcoholic, admittedly so, and I was a 30-year pothead. And it just, I think all that substance use just made things worse. And it wasn't until we got into recovery, my dad became sober, and I really started working the steps in recovery that I found a way to reconcile with my dad. So, I mean, that's really the story, and that seems to be resonating with people. I'm trying to tell people in detail about our journey and that there's hope in families who have some dysfunctional relationships.
Yeah, I came across the following passage toward the end of your book. I went into recovery in 2004, but there was no way I was going to make the 9th step amends to my dad. My father has gone into recovery before me, but he had never made amends to me, so why the hell should I make one with him?
You know, my dad, although he had stopped drinking in the 1990s, he recently remarried, or not so recently, but he was happy with his life with his second wife, and he didn't really understand why he was still habitually drinking. And it was then that he called a friend who was in AA and started going to meetings, but he didn't really work a program of recovery. He stopped going to meetings. He didn't have a sponsor. He didn't work the steps. He didn't take commitments. It was just not really a part of his program. There was no program. When I went into recovery in 2004, I kind of delved heavily into the program, and I'm still working a program with going to meetings and getting a sponsor and taking commitments and working the steps and reading the big book and all the things you have to do. It's a program of action. But I had this issue with my dad. I mean, he never made an amends to me, 9th step amends for all the trouble I had with him while he was drunk, frankly. And so I didn't see the need to make one to him. It felt like a big capitulation to him. I didn't want to. It was particularly because we were very much estranged during this period. I was also in Al-Anon. I'm a double winner. I almost immediately started going to Al-Anon meetings in addition to AA meetings, and I was really practicing the principle of detaching with love from my dad because our relationship had just become too toxic. It was just too difficult dealing with him. We just had no real tools to deal with situations in which we had a difference of opinion. That's just the bottom line. And I think it's a common issue with parents and their kids, or fathers and sons. And so as I was working the steps, I was making amends to people, but I just didn't feel the need to make an amends to my dad at that time because I felt like he had never made one to me. But then it was explained later on to me by a friend of mine in recovery that the amends wasn't really for my dad. It was for myself. It was for me to let go of some of my own resentments towards my dad and move on in my life. Resentment is a big obstacle to recovery. So says the big book, and that certainly was the case in my own life.
And you don't have to answer this question if you don't want to, but what did you want amends for back then?
Well, I don't know, like just 50 years of weird behavior. Look, here, the thing is, you have to understand is that my dad is a very interesting guy. I mean, he's a very talented man, a true artist in process, always trying to express himself artistically, created this iconic figure that had impact all over the world. My dad was a true Renaissance man. I mean, he had very many interests and capabilities. And for a guy with so little formal education, a very intelligent and inquisitive human being. But when it came to parenting, my father was definitely quite challenged. Really did not have any tools, from my experience. And this became particularly true for me. It really hit home for me when I had my own kids and really kind of observed the way that I just viscerally connected with them in a way that my father never connected with me. Now, the book, I try to talk about this honestly without judging him or criticizing him or blaming him. I mean, that's not the purpose of the book. I mean, the fact is that I give my father a lot of leeway for the fact that his parents were not warm and fuzzy and feeling. They didn't support him at all when he wanted to become an actor and go to Hollywood. He grew up in Boston. His parents were Ukrainian refugees, and they wanted him to go to college and become a doctor or a lawyer. So they cut him off. They were not great parenting skills on that part. When my dad came to LA, his focus was not family, it was survival, because we were a hand-to-mouth family, and he had to hustle odd jobs constantly to support us while pursuing his career. And I was always proud of my dad. So I give him a lot of leeway in terms of trying to stay away from the blame game. Mm-hmm. The fact of the matter is, however, there was a lot of things that happened with him that were just not appropriate, and that I never would have done with my kids, that would just, I think, were out of line, frankly. Mm. And I do draw some attention to it. Not every event that happened, but there were some key events that I tried to illustrate in the book about stuff that happened with him that was just wrong. So, I mean, and some of it was while he was intoxicated. So these are the kinds of things that we want to get the amends from, but that's not the way the program works. I mean, you make an amends and you don't expect one in return. And that's how it went down with my dad.
Yeah. And your book, it wraps up, I mean, not like a Hollywood ending necessarily, but it wraps up nicely with a little vignette with your son and how connected you are in comparison to you and your dad.
Yeah, he still drives me crazy, and I still piss him off plenty. My son and my daughter. A lot of the journey in the book, The Most Human, is also my relationship with them, because I'm trying to break this intergenerational cycle of dysfunction. And I talk a lot about our Jewish heritage. I mean, this has been going on for thousands of years. Because I talk a lot about this key passage in Torah, the Jewish Bible, about Abraham taking his son up to Mount Moriah to cut his throat. And, this is something we've had to live with as a part of our Jewish tradition. I love Torah. I study Torah. It enriches my life. I've found a lot of spirituality in reading the Hebrew Bible. I'm still studying it with a rabbi every Friday afternoon. It's an amazing document, and it's revolutionary in terms of monotheism. But there's a passage in there where there's this, the ultimate conflict. The father wants to kill his son. And I've been trying to figure out ways. That's the whole point of the book. I mean, The Most Human is really my journey to try to counteract 4,000 years of Jewish tradition in which there's been this conflict between fathers and sons. And I'm not alone. I mean, this is the thing about the book. It seems to resonate with people, is that I share this story, this my struggle to change this historical drama, this intergenerational trauma is what it is. And I've been sharing that in AA meetings, in Al-Anon meetings, anonymously. These people don't know I'm related to Leonard Nimoy. They don't need to know. It's just a father-son story. And when I talk about the fact that my dad and I were able to reconcile and that I've been trying to practice better behavioral patterns with my own children, it resonates with people at these meetings. I mean, I would share at these meetings and people would come up to me and say, I'm going to call my dad tonight and see if we can, patch things up. I'm going to call a mother or a brother or a sister. I mean, that's the whole point of the book. I'm trying to be of service to the community by sharing my story. Now, my kids and I are very close, but we still have conflict. And the question is, how do you deal with it? And the difference with my kids is that there was a visceral connection, a love connection with them since they were very young that I simply did not have with my dad. But I had a very different life than my dad. I didn't come to LA with nothing at age 18. I had more of an economic support base. I had family here. But I also had, like my dad, objectives and professional, aspirations like my dad. But I had a much more balanced lifestyle in terms of paying attention to my family, to my kids, and wanting to be very involved with them when they were younger.
Mm-hmm. So in my work, my clinical work in psychology and psychotherapy, I often find that addiction, problem use of various different substances or behaviors, compulsions, are often the result of trauma and or trouble regulating one's emotions is the phrase we use, pain and sadness and hopelessness. And the substances numb, they give us something to do that is like a ceremony. If you follow this routine, then you're distracted, right? It might help us to socialize with other people that are in the zone. So do you think that, and again, you don't have to answer this question, but for you and your observation of your dad and the intergenerational pattern, was this the case for you and your dad?
Well, yeah. I mean, my dad has talked about the fact that he used alcohol to deal with the pressures of professional life in Hollywood, particularly making Star Trek. I think he was in an interview with none other than Bill Shatner, in which he talked a lot about the fact that it was a way for him to decompress and self-medicate, and relax while they were making the show. It was very, very high pressure. My dad never really had a job that lasted more than 2 weeks before he got on Star Trek, and Star Trek lasted 3 years. And there were long hours on the set, and he was dealing with a lot of egos and, conflict with Bill as well. For me, it was pretty much a similar situation where I was looking for some escape and experimentation. And, I grew up in West LA I came of age in the 70s. I was in high school in the 70s. And when you start using, particularly marijuana, it was everywhere in West LA, you have an instant community. That was the key for me, because I was very much a loner and kind of on the fringe, and I like to describe myself as nerd, geek, and weirdo, and that's why I love Spock like everybody else, because Spock was was kind of the outsider, the only alien on the bridge of the Enterprise. He's the ultimate outsider, and Spock made being in that demographic cool. But so I wanted to kind of integrate with a more social scene and wanted to be hanging out with people and feel more at ease with other people. And marijuana was a way to do that, and it was fun. I mean, it was a lot of fun during the 70s. I mean, my life was much more interesting, and I was getting high all the time and chasing the Grateful Dead up and down the state of California and really enjoying myself. And at the same time, really striving to do well in academia. I mean, I was much like my dad. I was a high functioning addict. He was a high functioning alcoholic. My dad never missed a call time or an interview or a personal appearance. By the same token, I never missed a class, and I was never high in school. And I managed to make my way to UC Berkeley and do some really decent work there, I think, and then on to Loyola Law School. And you got to have it together to survive in those academic environments. So, but then for me, and it's very typical. We talk about this in recovery a lot. It's fun, then it's fun with problems, then it's just nothing but problems, because we're self-medicating, and also. You're in arrested development. I mean, I found this out early on, and I talk about this in my book, The Most Human. One of the early episodes of my recovery, I took a commitment, a literature commitment at a meeting, and I went to an AA bookstore to buy some literature. And the woman who ran that store explained to me that I was basically in arrested development, that even though I was 47 years old at the time when I went sober, that I had the emotional development of a 17-year-old boy. And that immediately pissed me off when she said that, basically because I had the emotional development of a 17-year-old boy. So, that is what happens when you're in an addiction and using on a regular basis. You're not growing because you're numbing yourself and not learning how to deal with life on life terms, as we say. And that's why I'm still in the program. I mean, I'm trying to grow up and trying to, find more maturity. And it takes time and it takes practice because, look, the fact of the matter is when people piss me off and, when someone, cuts me off on the San Diego freeway, my first thought is not live long and prosper. It's F you. And recovery for me has been a way to try to get, to my second thought and the first action that flows from that. And there are tools of recovery to do that, like count to 10, count to 20, restrain a pen and tongue, contrary action, let go and let God. And my all-time favorite, which is just do something, sit there. Because we're trying to get a grip on our brain, which is running, amok, as Spock might say, amok time. And we don't because we don't have control because I'm an addict, and that's the way I react to things. So I'm trying to live a more connected life in recovery, and I need tools to do that. And that's why I continue I'm 21 years sober now. I continue to go to meetings and work the steps.
Mm-hmm. You were saying earlier that your dad stopped going to meetings and stopped working the steps. And as someone who had a specialty with addictions and compulsive substance use, worked with people in 12-step groups, AA included, NA. And I think I know what you're saying. Sometimes we'll use the phrase dry drunk, or someone who is going to meetings in a crisis, and they might be serious, but once the crisis dies down and life gets back to normal, their spouse comes back to them, whatever, they say, okay, I'm good. And then they stop coming to meetings and they distance themselves from their sponsor, and they're not drinking yet, but eventually they get to the point where they're thinking, well, I can hold a drink at the party. It's not that big of a deal, and then the mindset starts to kick in of, I don't need to think about my feelings. I don't need to talk about my feelings. I don't need to face my issues. I can go back to the way I used to think, which is either like coasting or thinking that I'm strong and I can handle everything on my own. Is that what your dad was going through?
Well, yeah. Yes. My dad, simply stopped going to meetings and stopped working a program. And we do call those people dry drunks. And there were a number of situations. I mean, nothing changed behaviorally. The conflict with my dad remained. The only difference was there was no alcohol in the equation. But I can remember a number of situations where I would be in arguments with this guy, and I would think to myself, oh, my God, somebody get this guy a drink because he's impossible to deal with.
Yeah.
That is a big part of the equation, and this is what led to the climax of our, the apex of our conflict was that I was working a program of recovery, and I was in Al-Anon at the same time because he was my qualifier. Al-Anon is for family members, for people who have family members with addiction or alcohol issues. And one of the things I learned in Al-Anon was detaching with love, and I did that. I had to draw some very specific boundaries with my dad. The love part was that I continued to show up for my dad. And there was a lot to show up for. This is Leonard Nimoy. There was all kinds of things. There were the conventions and his photography exhibits and premieres and screenings. And we were at the Griffith Park Observatory in L.A. to celebrate the opening of the Leonard Nimoy Event Horizon Theater. He had contributed some money for them to renovate their theater, and we were all there for that. And there were a number of occasions where my dad simply did not acknowledge me because he was pissed off at me because I was kind of pulling away from him. And it really, it was very disconcerting for him. It made him more angry, in fact, because for him, he wanted to keep the engagement going with me, even if it meant on a negative level, even if it meant the arguments, because to him, negative engagement like that was better than the estrangement, period that we had entered into. And in fact, the result of that period was, again, the climax of our the dysfunction in our relationship was that my dad sent me a 6-page letter outlining all of my screw-ups, all the reasons why he thought that I was to blame for the failure of our relationship.
It's kind of the opposite of an amends letter, right?
Well, it's not only the opposite, it's the opposite of the 4th step, which is that, we take a fearless, moral inventory of ourselves, and instead of taking his own inventory, he took my inventory.
Yeah.
And that's just not recovery.
Yeah.
That's contrary to recovery. Now,
it's also really hurtful.
Well, it's very hurtful. It's very painful. This is what, this is where the amends came in, because I had I was reading through this letter. It was devastating, really, what he had written. He was not taking his own inventory. He was taking my inventory. And this is where, all that restraint of pen and tongue came in, because I didn't react to this situation with this letter. And I shared the fact that I was practicing the principles of restraint and pen and counting to 10, counting to 20, and contrary action, and don't just do something, sit there. I was practicing these principles and sharing about this situation with my dad at the meetings I was going to, both Al-Anon and 12-step. And my brothers and sisters in recovery were supportive of me, saying, you're practicing these principles in all your affairs. Step 12. This is what a life of recovery should look like. You're finally growing up. Congratulations. But another friend of mine in recovery who had about 10 years more than I did, and this is somebody I knew in high school, and I used to, one of my lower companions in high school, he told me, no, it's not good enough. This is your perfect opportunity, because your dad's done the work for you on the 4th step. By taking your inventory, he's listed all your the reasons why he thinks you're a part of the problem, and you should take that letter to your dad and make an amends to him. This is where it really came down. And I said, there's no freaking way I would ever do that. Why would I do that?
Did you agree with the things that were in the letter?
Well, unfortunately, most of it was true, of course. I mean, yeah, I'm human. That's the point of the book, the most human.
Yeah.
I'm human, just like my dad. I have foibles and I have character defects. There's no doubt about it, and I made a lot of mistakes, and I screwed up a lot of opportunities, and I said and did a lot of stupid things. There's no doubt about it. I mean, a lot of that letter was flat out true. And I didn't, and I took the direction from my friend. I went to make the amends to my dad. I didn't believe I should be doing it. I wasn't feeling it. I faked it till I made it, as we say in the program. I just took the action and hoped that the feeling would come along for the ride. And I made an amends to my dad for everything in that 6-page letter.
Where did it go from there? As you were going through recovery, as he was heading into his later years, and he died, you write about that in the book as well.
Yeah.
How did it end between the two of you? Well,
after that amends, everything changed. Everything changed after that, because he was very, the experience of making the amends to him, even though it wasn't that pleasant for me, he really seemed to enjoy the experience. So much so that, when it was over and he was seeing me out the door, I went to visit him at his house. He invited me to a Shabbat dinner the following Friday night, and everything changed with my dad, because he himself was also willing to let go of the resentments that he had towards me. That's what my friend had explained to me. I could be right about my dad, or I could be happy. But if I wanted to trudge the road of happy destiny, then I needed to go make the amends and let go of my own resentments towards my dad. I mean, one of my inclinations was to send him a 10-page letter with, taking his inventory, because I'd been taking his inventory all my life. And the point of what my friend was trying to make was time to let go of that. Stop taking his inventory. You may be right about it, but if you want to be happy, you yourself have to let go of resentment. This is a key to recovery. It's the key to my recovery. I don't want to have resentment against my dad, because I want to live, a life of serenity and spirituality. You can't do that when you're pissed off at people. It's, as we say in the program, it's like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. It makes no sense. It's so self-destructive. So, my dad was willing at that point to let go of his own resentment towards him, and we never looked back at the wreckage of our past. I mean, as we say in LA, a lot of these sayings that we have, when I first got into recovery, I just thought were freaking nonsense, and I didn't know what they meant. It just seemed like a lot of mumbo jumbo to me. But, I came to learn over time by working a program that these are real valuable tools for me to engage in recovery. And and there was nobody I needed to engage in that recovery more with than my dad. I mean, I had plenty of resentments against other people, but he was the mother of all resentments. And so after that, I talk about in the book about my experience with my second wife, Martha, when she was diagnosed with cancer. My dad became the go-to guy who helped me get through that whole period of my life. That's how things had changed so dramatically. I mean, it's just phenomenal. Recovery is amazing. It's a miracle. I never could have made it happen without those tools of recovery. And for the last 7 years of my dad's life, he and I were very close and had just a lot of great memories that we created together.
As a Trekkie myself, and you in the book touch on occasionally your moments of disdain for the fans. You talk about in the book how everyone seemed to think that the family was perfect and how the fans almost might have needed it to be that way. And meanwhile, you're just smiling at the red carpet kind of things and thinking it's not perfect and he's not perfect and I'm not perfect. And as a Trek fan myself, I'm not named after Captain Kirk, but I might as well have been, growing up in the 70s as a kid and watching Star Trek on the, reruns. And I've been following the story of Leonard Nimoy and William Shatner. And as a fan, I've always wanted them to be friends, but they had a lot of conflict. Leonard would say things and then Bill would say things. And I could never really figure out who was to blame or both of them were to blame. As you were talking about the way that your dad is and the way you talk about it in the book, and they certainly blamed each other. And your dad was pretty vocal about blaming Bill for their conflict, calling him, a prima donna and making everything about him and that kind of thing. Do you know anything about it? Because I'm personally just curious about it.
Kirk, I know everything about it.
You do?
Yeah, of course.
Care to share?
If I shared everything about it, I'd have to kill myself. Well, okay. So there's two things I want to address, and based on just what you just said. And number one is, it wasn't a disdain for the fans. Look, I'm a fan, and it's a fan-based business. And in promoting my book, The Most Human, all over this country, I'm talking to fans, and the love, the afterglow of Star Trek and Spock and Leonard has been phenomenal. I mean, the love I still feel with the fans, it's still resonating with them. And I get to experience some of that. I get that afterglow, even though my dad's been gone for 10 years now. We just celebrated the 10th anniversary of his passing, or observed, I should say, not celebrated. The fact is that the problem with the fans for me was that I had so much trouble relating to my dad, and that when we were trying to spend some father-son time together or some family time together, there were always the fans to deal with, and it just complicated things more. And it was just another obstacle to trying to find a way to connect to my dad. I understood the fandom because Star Trek is phenomenal. I mean, I was watching since the very first episode. The cover of my book is a picture of me on the set with my dad 6 weeks before the show even aired. I mean, I'm the first Trekkie. I'm the first cosplay, performer. I'm all in on Star Trek. And
there's a picture on the front of the book. You have hair like his, and
that's me, folks. That's the last week of July in 1966, 6 weeks before the show even got on the air. So, and my dad loved the fans, and my dad was very good with the fans and very patient with them. And that's something I actually admired and respected about my dad, because he was very good, and no matter what the circumstance, sometimes he'd say, I'm having dinner with my family, could you wait till afterwards, or something like that.
Yeah, you write that in the book, that from your perspective, he was kind and it was unrelenting. And the energy from the fans you could appreciate, and at the same time, as you say, it would interrupt. I imagine there would be times when you're thinking, I'm trying to get every morsel of love or attention or time or quality time with my dad, and it's constantly being interrupted. And we have to reset and start over every time, and always be at the lookout of, like, I don't want to start a sentence if someone's going to, I don't know, I'm just imagining that would be,
that would be annoying. Kind of what it's
know?
like. I mean, it really changed our lives, and it was something we had to get used to. It was just a function of his tremendous success. And we all enjoyed that. We all reveled in that. I mean, the fan mail started coming, and the paparazzi was coming around. We were a family. We were such an unknown. We were on the fringe. We were just a struggling family. We were, just completely anonymous. And then all of a sudden, all this glare, and it was exciting to begin with. But then it just became like a challenge, to really accept all that.
I don't think I knew that the paparazzi or the fandom or the fame was during the show. I always had this simplistic story that the show was watched by a select group of people, but it wasn't an instant hit until it was in syndication later. But you're saying that even when it was being shot and it was airing.
Oh no, it was a hit.
Okay.
It was a hit. Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it just didn't. They kept switching the time, slot for it, which was problematic because it ended up on a Friday night, which is, a death knell for a series in the 60s because no one's taping anything and everybody's out on the weekend and not at home watching TV. No, I mean, it became, the monster that it became because of syndication in the 70s. That's true. 5 days a week at 5 o'clock on local TV stations, and then all day on the weekend or marathon weekends for during the holiday weekends. So that's when it really exploded. But the fact is that Star Trek was a hit from the when it first aired, and there was a fanzine called 16 Magazine that accidentally printed our home address as the mailing address for fan mail, and then all of a sudden we're just inundated with this stuff, and then people showing up at our door. And as I say, these photographers showing up and reporters showing up all the time, and we're putting on the face of this big, happy, wonderful, idyllic family, and we were. I mean, it was. I mean, it was pretty happy situation. We were certainly happy that my father had achieved some success because it was such a struggle before then. But behind the scenes, my dad and I were just not connecting on any level because my dad was a very reserved, introspective kind of guy. As I say, he was focused on survival, his career and family, and and there was just and his parents weren't very warm and fuzzy with him. Luckily, my mother was the nurturing parent in the family. So, there was always that going on. But the fact is that we were all celebrated in that early success of my dad, and came to really appreciate all of the benefits of that success, all the trappings of success. There's no doubt about it. It's been a wonderful life.
Yeah,
I'm not complaining in the least. Now, on the subject of Bill, I love Bill. Bill loves Leonard. I love Leonard. Loving Leonard is complicated. And they had a lot of tension on the set while they were making the show because of the immense popularity by this strange-looking guy from the planet Vulcan. I mean, Spock became very popular very quickly for clearly obvious reasons. I mean, it's just an incredible character that my dad had created. And people glommed onto that. And it was a problem for Bill early on, and it's understandable. Bill was the star of the show. Look, you got two Jewish guys who were only 4 or 5 days apart in age and very competitive with one another and big egos. You got to have a big ego to survive in Hollywood. And there was a lot of clash between the two of them. Thankfully, later on in life, Bill and Leonard found each other, and they had a very loving, close relationship. I mean, one day I was with my dad and my sister, and my dad announced to us that Bill Shatner was his best friend. And my sister and I looked at each other. We were like, "What? What are you talking about?" And my dad said, "Yeah, what's wrong with that? Bill's my best friend. Bill's your best friend. You've been complaining about him for 30 years." But the fact is, they really did find each other. They had a very close and loving relationship, and I think that was to be admired. Unfortunately, they couldn't sustain it. I mean, there's stuff that Bill did, there's stuff that Leonard did, there's grudges that Leonard held. It is what it is. I can't really comment on all that. It's just the way that Leonard and Bill were built. That they found each other at all was a miracle. And the fact of the matter is that only thing that really matters is that Kirk and Spock are an amazing dynamic duo in pop culture history. They're iconic. They're one of the greatest. And I would ask my dad, well, how is it that you guys are so good on camera? I mean, we just love their relationship. And my dad would say, well, we're professionals. When the cameras were rolling, they were in it. They were playing it in the moment, and they were connecting and playing off of each other. Without Bill Shatner's Captain Kirk, we would not have Leonard Nimoy's Mr. Spock. That's just a flat. My dad himself has admitted that, because my dad started off with Jeff Hunter. Jeff Hunter is nothing like Bill Shatner. You know, Captain Chris Pike was very introverted and introspective and withdrawn and remote, like Spock. So how can you play that when there's another guy playing that? You know?
Well, and the original pilot, I think, I don't know if it's the official pilot, but what you're referring to is the first pass at the cast and the style of the show. Your father, I don't know if he was given this direction by Gene Roddenberry, but it was a very different Spock in that first episode. He's loud. It's a very different vibe, and I'm curious if you know how that shift was made. Did your father influence that?
Well, the shift was made when Jeff Hunter turned down the role when they were going to make a second pilot. Their first pilot did not sell the show. We're talking about The Cage. And with Jeff Hunter and Susan Oliver, who was excellent. They're both excellent in that episode. One of my favorite is the menagerie, how Gene Roddenberry brilliantly folded it into the regular season of the series with that two-parter with the court-martial of Spock. The fact is that, what happened was Bill Shatner came along, and his whole take on the character was was very Douglas Fairbanks like. It was a lot of flamboyance and panache and wink in the eye and and a real extroverted type of captain. And I think it's fabulous. I love Kirk. I mean, I just love him. And you need that for someone like Spock to play off of. They really did play off. It's really like Lennon and McCartney. It's a matter of one-upmanship.
Well, I know. So I'm a huge Beatles fan and John and Paul fan. And similarly, for us fans, it's hard to watch your heroes fighting with each other, right? And the simplistic story that the tabloids would have is that they hated each other, but they actually were friends, and they would fight and they would write songs about each other. How can you sleep at night? That kind of stuff. Three-legged dog, all that kind of. And it was hurtful. And John could be very, very biting, but Paul would roll with it, and John was a sweetheart. So it kind of sounds like your father and Bill Shatner had a similar dynamic. Like from the outside, it could be simplistically seen as like they hate each other, and I think a common thing, like with John and Paul, with Leonard and Bill, is everyone's trying to figure out who's the asshole, and depending on, I don't know, your leadings, there's people that'll stick up for Paul or John or Kirk or Spock. It's always more complicated than that, of course, and it's just really interesting to hear your take on that. It's actually comforting. I'll tell you. Yeah, it's dumb, but I want my heroes I want to like them. I don't want to have to take a side. Mm-hmm. It's okay, to fight, but and I always say, and sometimes even on this podcast, my best friend I podcast with, he sits there, and we've had some big fights and cried right here on camera. It gets real, and I've always said the closer you get, the more you're going to bump up against their sharp edges. You can avoid the sharp edges, but you're just going to be distant and lonely for the rest of your life. Mm-hmm. When I picked up your book, I didn't know what style of book it would be, because it was about your relationship with your dad. And I didn't know how much Star Trek would actually be in it, because I'm thinking, why would Adam Nimoy want to talk about Star Trek, something that happened so long ago. But you start off the book with a quote from The Wrath of Khan. You quote from the movie where, Captain Kirk is talking about Spock after he died, and the eulogy, and he says, "Of my friend, I'll cry, Adam, if I read this line. But of my friend, I can only say this: of all the souls I have encountered in my travels, his was the most human." Okay, I got through it. Bill, well, now I'm starting to cry. That's that whole dynamic, when Spock dies, and I don't know, it's a big deal to me. So it meant a lot to me that you included that in the front of the book. I also wanted to, before you go, because we're at the end here, I wanted to read another passage that I I liked. You say, like Spock, my father was often inscrutable. It was hard to know what he was thinking or feeling. The similarity to the half-human, half-Vulcan science officer didn't end there. Like Spock, Dad was not the warm and fuzzy type. Which is interesting because I always had the impression, based on other acting gigs that he had, I always remember him from the Pod People with Donald Sutherland.
Invasion, yeah.
Invade Body Snatchers. And a lot of the and the fact that your father also released albums, wherein he sang, really jovially or actively, he was a performer. He didn't sing like Spock did, he was a regular human being. So I always envisioned him at home being like, and maybe he was, but I always envisioned him being fun and warm. But reading your book, it sounds like maybe there were moments like that, but he also could be kind of like Spock at home too. Is that true?
Yeah. I mean, he, it was tough having good times with him. It was really tough. He was all about the work, and he was very preoccupied. This is when I was living there. It was 3 years of Star Trek, 2 years of Mission Impossible, and then he made a movie in Spain, and then he was doing theater all through the 70s. He was just not, really, he's not an engaging kind of guy. He wasn't I talk about the fact that we didn't hang out and do stuff together. This is very different than the experience I had with my own kids, because, my dad was raised in Boston during the Depression, and he didn't really have a whole lot of time for child's play. That wasn't a big part of his growing up. It was really about working odd jobs and generating money for the family, pursuing his acting passion, and trying to figure out how to get out of the West End. He came to LA when he was 18 with basically nothing. I had a very different upbringing. When I was 10 years old, Star Trek went on the air, and things started to get, comfortable in Southern California for me. I was definitely a child of that era in terms of soaking up all the pop culture that was available. And I'm talking about the Fab Four. I'm talking about Amazing Spider-Man comic books and the incredible TV that was on during the 60s. So we just had, we were just generations apart, my dad and I. In contrast, when I had my own kids, they were born in sunny Southern California like me, and I like to do all the stuff they like to do, which was, play music, go to listen to music, and go to the movies together. And I coached my daughter's soccer team. I took Jonah to all his gigs, my son, who now is all over the world with the Offspring. I've been, and I travel with him, and when I can, I meet them overseas, and because I'm an Offspring fanatic, I turned him on to that band. You know what I'm saying? So there's always this visceral connection that we've had from the very beginning that I just simply didn't have with my dad.
In closing, yeah, you had a different financial or economic experience, and it's in a different environment, LA, Boston, but it's possible that your dad experienced a similar kind of hurt, a similar kind of distance, and that can do a number on you. It can make you feel like you're not worth it, like you don't matter. It can make you feel like you're always hungry, like you're never getting enough, and you talk about the transgenerational trauma, and so although it can look like you have it made as a kid, but emotionally, maybe not so much.
Well, it's just I have different issues. We're all dealing with issues, and that is really what I want to say about recovery in general. It's like you don't have to be an alcoholic or an addict to be in recovery. We're all recovering from something, whether it's some family dysfunction or childhood trauma or the failure of a marriage, the loss of a career, some physical infirmity we're trying to get over, some natural disaster. I mean, in LA, we're all in recovery after the fires. I mean, we're all traumatized by that. The 12-step recovery are simply tools to help us deal with life on life's terms. And that's the whole point of the book, is that I'm hoping that people will take away from some of the things that I learned and some of the experiences I had to illuminate and help them with their own experiences. I'm just trying to be of service to people. And yeah, my dad had a hole to fill with his parents. They never said they were proud of him or that they loved him. I knew they felt that way. I mean, they were downright giddy when the fans turned their attention to them and were sending them fan mail, but they never were able to connect with my dad on that level. And I think that was, it was missing for him. It was a hole that he needed to fill. And that's why he needed my, amends so much, because even though he had the love and adoration of millions of fans all over the world, it was me that he wanted to be connected to. Deep down, I really think he wanted that connection. And by making the amends to him and giving him what he needed and then just moving on, we really built a relationship that I think he really, really wanted all of his life with me. He just didn't know how to make it happen. He just didn't have the tools.
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming on the podcast, Adam. The book is The Most Human, Reconciling with My Father. There it is right there. It's way more deep than the way we're talking about it. Like you say, you go into a lot of religion, history, and your mother and your journey as a kid, as an adult, recovery, as a father. It's a good read. It's interesting. Even if you don't know what Star Trek is, I would imagine that it would be interesting and thought-provoking, and maybe there's a lot to relate to for people, and maybe motivating. Maybe have you heard that from people, that it has helped them to think about recovery for themselves or how to value this sort of work?
Absolutely. As I've been promoting this book across the country since June when it was published, people come up to me after the presentation afterwards and they talk about their own family experience. And that's the point, that we're talking about it, processing it together, sharing our common experience, and hopefully finding new ways to make amends and mend dysfunctional relationships. That's the whole point.
Well, thanks for coming on the podcast. At the end of every episode, I always say that everyone should take care of themselves. I want to give you a chance to give the reason as to why people should take care of themselves.
Why they should take care of themselves? Well, I tell you, Kirk, because we have so little time on this planet, why waste the time? I mean, look, it took 4.6 billion years to make the planet. Dinosaurs ruled the planet for 150 million years, and human evolution took 6 million years. We're just a little wink in the eye. So, let's spend our time here, loving one another. I think that's what we're here for, to love and be loved. And we should stay in the moment and stay with that message. We live in such a dysfunctional society now, particularly, on the political front. There's so much toxicity. I think we really need to push back with that, and it starts at home with our family and our relationships. So, in closing, I would like to simply say to everybody out there: live long and prosper.
Indeed, because you deserve it.